Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Flight Risk, starring Mark Wahlberg, Michelle Dockery, and Topher Grace, directed by Mel Gibson. Now, I heard this movie was a lot of fun going into the movie theater, but was it as fun as people say it is? Well, let's get into it and we'll see. As I've seen interviews with Mel Gibson about, I'll talk about it. We start in Alaska with Winston, played by that '70s show's Topher Grace, heating up some chicken noodle soup until not only a moose shows up, but the Marshalls, led by Madeline Harris, played by Michelle Dockery. And Topher Grace sounds like the character he played on that '70s show more than what he plays in this movie, as he uses the facilities and uses Bob and Jeff to help Winston. Madeline does, with his pants in order to use the facilities, which was rather dumb. As we move on to the next day, and Madeline brings Winston in a private plane, all cuffed up, and calls his boss Caroline Van Sant, while Winston is not nonstop talking. And the pilot Daryl Booth, played by Mark Wahlberg, comes in, and I like the three main characters as Daryl comes off unhinged in from interviews I've heard in this performance. After seeing it the second time, yes, he does come off that way. I'll talk about it later. And the movie, while Winston comes off like Eric Foreman from that '70s show, and Madeline comes off like the hardest character to relate with throughout because she's a giant hard ass. Speaking of that '70s show, that sounds like Red. Anyways, moving on. This entire movie, and very one fucking note for this whole movie. While on the air, Madeline puts on the headphones to communicate with Daryl while completely ignoring Winston, and she notices something is up with Daryl with the cut on his neck and later with blood on his arm like he killed someone. And Winston mocks both Madeline and Daryl as he pretends they're flirting, and he says about Madeline how very controlling and she is. And one note she is, and that's just like what I said, which he sounds like Daryl by saying, if we were cousins, we'd already be married, which was hilarious, as this dialogue was sometimes hilarious, until they hit a bird. That's not the funny part. And eventually, Winston finds out Daryl isn't who he says he is, as we never got his real name for the rest of the movie, as I'm just going to call him Daryl for the rest of the show. Tries to alert Madeline about the situation, Winston does, and Daryl gives Winston back to throw up in, and that's when she sees something is up with Daryl while they're in the middle of the mountains. And at one point, he says they're traveling to Seattle, and she knows something is wrong, and she tries to make Daryl cooperate, and Van Sant, but nothing is going through as they go in the clouds, and Madeline knows Daryl is bullshitting by saying a female pilot who flew here the week before, and that was suspenseful to begin with, as I'm so far having fun with it. Madeline tries to shoot Daryl as he knocks her out and says to tell Winston his boss, Moretti, who happens to be a criminal, wants him dead. And Winston tries to bullshit his way out of it and offering Daryl $1 million, but Daryl somehow declines while smashing Winston's glasses, which is fucked up. And if he can't see as well as we'll see it later in the movie, and Madeline wakes up and stuns Daryl, to knock him the fuck out until he gets up, and she continuously stuns him, and I'm just like, fucking pass out until he does. And Madeline pulls the plane, and luckily not crash while she's flying the plane. It puts on the autopilot first off, and I don't think she has the license to fly a plane to begin with, as she checks in with Winston after he leaks himself for a knife from the first aid kit, and she tries to cut herself out of captivity, or him, and she tries to drag him while Winston, and by him I mean Daryl, while Winston helps her moving Daryl to the back of the plane. And we see Daryl's bald head, as that was revealed in the trailer, as I heard Mark Wahlberg shaved his head and acted all unhinged on set as the character of Daryl, as that was a great choice of Mark Wahlberg, but bad choice on the advertising to show him as the bad guy. I mean, there's no way around it, sure, but come on. Winston sees Moretti has a picture of Winston's mother's house, and Madeline tries to help Winston by calming him down while he sits up front with Madeline. And Madeline tries to get some help from the aviation frequency while one of the guys thought she was fucking around and eventually communicates with her while Madeline calls Van Sant to tell her she's flying the plane as Daryl is a bad guy and gets the pilot to help Madeline out while Daryl wakes up and acts all unhinged like a typical criminal. And the dialogue was sometimes flat and sometimes very funny. Madeline gets a call from a pilot named Hassan, who asks her out to dinner after they land, after they land the plane. But first, he helps Madeline out flying the plane and explains how it works as well as straightening this plane, and switches it back to autopilot as it was turned off earlier, like a few minutes ago. As Daryl tries to break his way free while tormenting Winston and Madeline, and Van Sant calls, and the real Daryl Booth had his eyes and tongue cut out of him, and they almost crash into a mountain as she pulls up by the plane, but the plane hits the snow while Daryl grabs the knife under the chair, or a knife under the chair, as he was sitting at earlier in the film, and now Madeline has the pilot's chair, and Daryl has the most fun out of any of them, and they felt fun, and that felt fun while the dialogue is terrible for damn sure. Daryl torments Madeline about what she did in her past as she killed someone named Maria 2 years ago, and she continuously beats the shit out of Daryl, and he grabs her sunglasses to release himself from the handcuffs that were slapped on him by Winston earlier in the film. And I don't care for the backstory of Madeline telling Winston about, as Van Sant calls her about her work history, as she's led to believe she can't talk to her, but takes it up to Director Coleridge, and she's led to believe there's a mole in her office, as Van Sant is that mole, as she's led to believe, and I don't trust where she's going with this. And the script was predictable, as Madeline gets to the coast and calls Hassan, and he advises to make a left there when they get to the ocean. As Daryl breaks free, and Winston says Coleridge is the mole in her office, and Madeline after she learns it from Winston, tells Van Sant what she thought it was her when it was really Coleridge, and I saw that coming like a mile away. It wasn't funny. They see a shipwreck as the ship called the Fair Dancer, and Hassan tracks their location while they hang up, and Daryl comes in stabbing Winston and choking on Madeline until Winston cuts Daryl in the fingers, and Madeline shoots a flare gun at Daryl, and Madeline knocks Daryl out with a fire extinguisher and puts out the fire and says nobody gives a fuck what his name is. And I agree, as I'm calling him Daryl for the rest of the fucking movie, so fuck whatever the fuck his name is. And Madeline does her best healing Winston and puts a damn needle on his arm as he gets knocked out for a while, and the action scenes are staled as the one-liner was pretty stupid, while Hassan calls Madeline as she explains the situation to Hassan, and Winston is in critical condition and tells her how to get her landing location quicker, as Winston is still hanging on, as Madeline takes off the handcuffs from Winston, and she knows she can trust him now, which came a little too late, as that was pointless. And there were times the movie went to pointless routes. Winston explains how sorry he is, as he's afraid he's going to die, and tells Madeline to talk to Winston's mother and tell her he's a hero, as Madeline calls Van Sant, and Coleridge answers it and tells Madeline Van Sant is dead, and Madeline knows Coleridge is up to something as he was involved in Van Sant's accident, and cusses his ass out and gets his son on the line and switches the radio to a particular channel as a fighter plane came for them, and the Daryl wakes up and torments them as they find their destination. And Madeline tells Hassan she has to land the plane while she feels no pulse in Winston, while Daryl breaks a bone and gets his way out of the handcuffs, and Daryl attacks Madeline as they run out of gasoline and makes a rough landing. and Daryl is out of the plane and gets smashed by a fire truck, as that was laughable in a painful way. And after the plane lands roughly, Winston wakes up as he's alive, gets to the medic and gets the medics to help him out to the ambulance, and Madeline gets off the plane and tells the statue Hawaiian dancer to fuck off. And Madeline meets Hassan while she sees one of Moretti's men and is trying to kill Winston, but Madeline shoots the motherfucker dead, and Coleridge calls the murderer, and Madeline picks up the phone and says he's finished. And the climax was a quick 90-minute of a movie, as I was entertained. But how entertained was I? Let's get to the rating. I'll give this movie a 5.1 out of 10. Not one of director Mel Gibson's best movies, but this is better than The Man Without a Face and The Passion of the Christ. It's not good as his masterpieces like Braveheart, Hacksaw Ridge, and a good film, Apocalypto, as this was all right and not a great movie, but I was entertained, and the 90 minutes goes by the time from start to finish, as it's not going to win any awards by any means, as some of the dialogue was flat and sometimes very funny. And I know going into the movie theater that Mark Wahlberg is the bad guy, as that was a bad choice on the advertisements, as I saw the reveals coming like a mile away. I like the performances by Mark Wahlberg, as he plays unhinged good, but while Topher Grace reminds me of Eric Foreman from that 70s show, so it felt familiar. And Madeline comes off like a hard ass, but I don't care for her backstory, and the dialogue is flat. Like, the one-liner Madeline says to Daryl was pretty fucking stupid, and there were times the movie went pointless routes. This may be a pointless movie in director Mel Gibson's filmography, as this isn't going to win any awards by any means necessary, but it's entertaining, as this is a weak recommendation for this movie, as it's one of those turn off your brain kind of movies, and at the end of the day, you'll have fun with it. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me for this Mel Gibson filmography, and until he comes up with the passion, or let me rephrase that, the resurrection of the Christ, y'all need a pilot?